Operation Northwoods. In March 1962, inside a secure conference room at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff placed a classified document on the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The document, signed by all 5 members of America's highest military command, proposed a series of staged terrorist attacks on American soil. The targets included civilian aircraft. The victims would be American citizens. The perpetrators, by design, would appear to be Cuban operatives, providing the political justification for a full-scale military invasion of Cuba. The plan was called Operation Northwoods. It was not the work of rogue officers or conspiracy theorists. It was an official, stamped, and formally presented proposal from the United States military to its own civilian leadership. The operation outlined attacks in extraordinary detail: fake funerals for fake victims, drone aircraft disguised as commercial flights, destroyed over Cuban airspace with fabricated passenger manifests, bombings in Miami and Washington, D.C., staged to look like Cuban intelligence operations, sinking of a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay. The document even suggested provoking Cuban forces into firing on American planes, establishing a pretext for war that the American public would demand. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, and entirely serious. The Joint Chiefs estimated that a sufficiently provoked public would support military action within 72 hours of the first incident. President John F. Kennedy rejected the plan immediately. McNamara buried it. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who signed the document, was quietly removed from his position months later and transferred to NATO command in Europe, a reassignment that generated no public explanation at the time. The documents remained classified for nearly 4 decades. They were only released in 1997 under the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, surfacing without announcement in the National Archives. No congressional investigation followed. No military tribunal was convened. No officer who signed the proposal faced any formal accountability. The mainstream press covered the declassification briefly. Within weeks, the story disappeared from major publications. The final version of the document, 33 pages detailing state-sponsored false flag terrorism against American citizens, remains one of the most declassified and least discussed government files in American history. If the most powerful military in the world formally proposed murdering its own citizens to start a war and faced no consequences when exposed, what does that imply about the plans that were never rejected and never declassified? Operation Dropshot. On January 1, 1957, a team of U.S. Air Force strategic planners finalized a document so extreme that its classification level exceeded that of most nuclear launch codes. The plan, known as Operation Dropshot, called for the simultaneous delivery of 300 nuclear bombs and 29,000 tons of conventional explosives across the Soviet Union in a single, coordinated strike. The targets were not military installations alone. They included Moscow, Leningrad, Odessa, and more than 100 Soviet cities, entire urban populations designated as acceptable casualties in a first strike scenario projected for the year 1957. Dropshot was not a contingency plan. It was a fully operational blueprint. The Air Force had calculated delivery routes, estimated bomb yields, projected Soviet counterattack responses, and modeled post-war occupation zones. The plan divided the Soviet Union into 4 post-war regions, each to be administered by Allied military governors, following what planners euphemistically called the pacification of Soviet resistance. The projected civilian death toll, buried in appendix tables, exceeded 60 million people in the first 30 days. That figure did not include radiation casualties, infrastructure collapse, or famine projections, which one internal annex estimated would double the toll within 6 months. The plan assumed the Soviet Union would not have sufficient nuclear capability to retaliate effectively before American air superiority neutralized their launch infrastructure. That assumption was wrong. By 1957, Soviet nuclear capacity had grown faster than American intelligence had reported, a failure later attributed to deliberate gaps in CIA surveillance assets over Siberian launch sites. Whether those gaps were accidental has never been established. Dropshot was declassified in 1977 under a Freedom of Information Act request and published with minimal redaction. The National Security Archive at George Washington University holds the complete document. Historians who have analyzed it note that the targeting list bears a striking resemblance to NATO nuclear planning documents from the same period, several of which remain classified to this day. Requests to cross-reference Dropshot's targeting matrices against surviving Soviet civil defense records have been denied by both the U.S. Department of Defense and the Russian FSB, citing ongoing national security considerations. A plan to kill 60 million people in one night was drafted, approved at the highest levels, and then quietly filed away. The question is not whether it was ever intended to be used. The question is what replaced it, and whether what replaced it was worse. Plan R-12. In the autumn of 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev authorized the detonation of Tsar Bomba, a 50-megaton hydrogen device detonated over Novaya Zemlya, the largest nuclear explosion in human history. What the world did not know was that Tsar Bomba was a reduced-yield test. The original device had been designed at 100 megatons. Soviet weapons scientists, led by Andrei Sakharov, reduced the yield by half before the test, citing concerns that the full detonation would risk fallout reaching Moscow itself. The 100-megaton design was shelved but never dismantled. Its targeting application, internally designated Plan R-12, survived the test modification. Plan R-12 called for the 100-megaton device to be detonated approximately 3 kilometers above the mid-Atlantic Ocean, at a specific coordinate located equidistant between the eastern seaboard of the United States and the coast of Western Europe. Classified Soviet military physics papers, partially declassified by the Russian government in 2001, described the intended effect: a thermal pulse covering an area of approximately 2.7 million square kilometers, a pressure wave sufficient to collapse reinforced structures across coastal cities from Halifax to Lisbon, and an electromagnetic pulse disabling every electronic system on both continents simultaneously. No missile defense system in 1961 or today would have intercepted a device delivered by a modified Tu-95 Bear bomber flying at operational altitude. Sakharov himself later wrote in his memoirs that he had been disturbed by the military's enthusiasm for the full-yield application. He describes a meeting in which a senior Soviet general referred to the mid-Atlantic detonation as the opener, implying a sequence of follow-on strikes, the details of which Sakharov claimed he was never shown. Those meeting minutes remain classified in the Russian Federal Archives. Requests by independent historians for access have been denied on 6 separate occasions since 1995. The 100-megaton weapons engineering schematics were reportedly transferred to a secure storage facility in Sarov, the closed nuclear city formerly known as Artemis-16, in 1963. No public confirmation of their destruction has ever been issued. The facility remains off-limits to international inspectors under current Russian federal law. A weapon designed to collapse 2 continents simultaneously was built, tested at half power, and then stored rather than destroyed. What happened to the blueprints that Sakharov was never shown? Operation Unthinkable. On May 22, 1945, 14 days after Germany's formal surrender, Winston Churchill handed a classified directive to his military chiefs with a single instruction: prepare a plan to attack the Soviet Union by July 1st. The war in Europe had ended less than 2 weeks earlier. British soldiers were still counting their dead, and the Prime Minister was already designing the next war, one that would require rearming and deploying surrendered Wehrmacht divisions alongside British and American forces against their recent Soviet allies. The plan was called Operation Unthinkable. The proposal was staggering in its implications. Churchill's directive called for a surprise offensive into Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe using 47 Allied divisions, including 10 to 15 German divisions whose soldiers had not yet been fully disarmed or demobilized. The British Chiefs of Staff were tasked with producing a feasibility assessment. They delivered their report on June 8, 1945. The conclusion was stark. The operation would be militarily catastrophic. Soviet forces in Europe outnumbered Allied forces by a ratio of approximately 4-to-1 in ground troops and 2-to-1 in operational armor. The assessment warned that initiating hostilities would almost certainly result in a long war of attrition that Allied publics, exhausted from 6 years of conflict, would not support. Churchill was presented with the report and declined to proceed. The documents were classified at the highest level and locked in British military archives. They remained entirely unknown to the public until 1998, when the Public Record Office declassified them without any formal government announcement. When journalists asked the Ministry of Defense for comment, a spokesperson described the plan as a routine contingency exercise. No further questions were entertained. What the declassified documents do not address is whether any portion of Unthinkable's intelligence framework, specifically the identification and cataloging of Soviet military positions across Eastern Europe, was transferred to other operations. Documents from the same archive period referencing a follow-on assessment, designated JS 45-1160, remain classified. Requests for their release have been denied under the UK Freedom of Information Act on grounds of national security, a justification that, 80 years after the plan's conception, has never been publicly explained. Churchill planned to restart a world war using Nazi soldiers before the last one was over. The feasibility report survives. The intelligence files that fed it do not. PSYOP 62. In the summer of 1961, newly elected President John F. Kennedy was briefed on America's current nuclear war plan. What he heard left him visibly shaken. According to aides present in the room, Kennedy stood up, walked to the window, and said nothing for nearly 2 minutes. The document he had just reviewed was the Single Integrated Operational Plan for 1962, known as PSYOP 62, and it called for the simultaneous launch of every nuclear weapon in the American arsenal against the Soviet Union, China, and all Soviet-aligned nations, regardless of whether those nations were directly involved in any conflict that triggered the plan. PSYOP 62 was not a flexible response document. It was a single, all-or-nothing execution order. If it were activated by a Soviet first strike, by a conventional invasion of Western Europe, or under certain alert thresholds that lower-level commanders could trigger independently, every nuclear warhead in the U.S. inventory would launch within minutes. The plan made no distinction between military and civilian targets. Urban centers, industrial zones, and agricultural regions were targeted simultaneously. The Joint Chiefs briefed Kennedy that projected casualties for the full execution of PSYOP 62 ranged between 275 million and 600 million deaths, depending on wind patterns and whether China entered the conflict in its first 48 hours. Kennedy was reportedly told that individual theater commanders had pre-delegated authority to execute portions of the plan under specific conditions, meaning a general in West Germany could, under certain circumstances, initiate a nuclear strike without direct presidential authorization. Kennedy ordered an immediate review. The resulting modifications took 18 months and faced sustained resistance from Air Force Strategic Air Command leadership, who argued that flexibility degraded deterrence credibility. The full text of PSYOP 62 remains classified. Partial documents were released through the National Security Archive in 2004, but critical sections, specifically those governing pre-delegated launch authority and the targeting criteria for Chinese population centers, remain redacted. Analysts who have reviewed the available sections note that the mathematical models used to calculate acceptable casualties bear a structural resemblance to planning frameworks still referenced in current nuclear posture reviews. A document authorizing the killing of 600 million people was presented to a president as standard policy. The parts describing who else could authorize it remain hidden. What authorization structures currently exist that no president has reviewed in a window-facing silence? Operation Lurline. In 1956, NATO's supreme Allied commander in Europe authorized the development of a classified defensive nuclear strategy so extreme that its existence was denied by multiple governments for over 3 decades. Operation Lurline, also referenced in some declassified documents as part of the broader carte blanche nuclear exercise framework, called for the pre-positioning of nuclear landmines, officially designated atomic demolition munitions, along the inner German border and through the Fulda Gap. In the event of a Soviet conventional ground invasion, these devices, each with yields between 1 and 15 kilotons, would be detonated sequentially as Soviet armor advanced, creating a radioactive barrier across Central Europe. The plan was technically defensive. It was also guaranteed to render the territory it was defending uninhabitable. West German government officials were not informed of the full extent of the mining plan. A 1979 West German parliamentary inquiry into NATO nuclear dispositions received confirmation that atomic demolition munitions had been deployed on German soil, but was denied specific information about quantities, locations, and yield capacities on grounds of alliance operational security. The inquiry's final report, published in 1980, omitted the sections covering ADM deployment. 3 members of the parliamentary committee later stated publicly that they had been pressured to exclude those sections by NATO liaison officers. The devices themselves, the American-built Special Atomic Demolition Munition and its larger counterpart, were small enough to be carried in a backpack and armed by a 2-man team. Approximately 300 of these devices were deployed across Western Europe at the peak of the Cold War, according to figures published by the Natural Resources Defense Council in 2001. Their precise locations were never disclosed to the governments of the nations on whose territory they sat. When the devices were finally removed in the 1980s, no public announcement was made, and no environmental assessment of storage sites was released. The Federal Archives in Koblenz hold NATO correspondence from the period referencing Lurline by name, but the documents are flagged for joint U.S.-German classification review, a process that has been pending since 2003 with no projected completion date. 300 nuclear devices were buried across Europe without the knowledge of the governments above them. The paperwork describing where they were placed is still being reviewed. By whom and toward what end remains unannounced. Project Pluto. Between 1957 and 1964, the United States Atomic Energy Commission funded a program at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to develop a weapon so indiscriminate in its destruction that even its own designers privately questioned whether it should ever be used. The weapon was a nuclear-powered cruise missile, officially designated SLAM, or Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, built around a project known as Project Pluto. What made SLAM different from every other nuclear delivery system was not its warhead. It was the engine. Project Pluto developed a nuclear ramjet that required no fuel, could fly at Mach 3 at treetop altitude indefinitely, and exhausted unshielded reactor core air directly into its wake, meaning that the missile's flight path itself became a continuous radioactive contamination event before a single warhead was dropped. SLAM was designed to carry between 16 and 26 nuclear warheads, dispensing them across multiple targets in a single sustained low-altitude flight that could last hours. After its warheads were delivered, the missile would continue flying across population centers, water supplies, agricultural land, until its reactor material was exhausted. Test documents from the Lawrence Livermore Archive, partially declassified in 1994, described the post-delivery flight path as a secondary area denial effect. The projected contamination corridor for a single SLAM flight across the Soviet interior was estimated at approximately 1,000 kilometers in length and 30 kilometers in width. The Air Force canceled Project Pluto in 1964, citing advances in ICBM technology that made the system redundant. The official cancellation notice, available through the Department of Energy's OpenNet database, describes the decision as purely strategic and economic. It does not reference the weapon's indiscriminate radioactive contamination profile, which critics, including several Livermore scientists who signed an internal dissent memo in 1963, had argued made the weapon illegal under existing laws of war. That dissent memo is not available through OpenNet. Its existence is confirmed only through a footnote in a 1994 Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists article, whose author declined to identify his primary source. Requests to Livermore for the document under the Freedom of Information Act have been returned incomplete on 3 separate occasions, each time citing exemptions for nuclear weapons design information. A missile designed to irradiate everything beneath it for 1,000 kilometers was tested, dissented against by its own creators, and canceled without the dissent ever entering the public record. What else was in that memo that no one was supposed to read? Operation Gladio. In November 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stood before Parliament and confirmed the existence of a NATO-backed clandestine paramilitary network that had been operating on Italian soil since 1956. The network, known as Gladio, had been established by NATO and the CIA as a stay-behind operation, a secret army of trained operatives who would conduct sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. What Andreotti's statement did not fully address, and what subsequent parliamentary investigations began to uncover, was that Gladio's operational mandate extended well beyond post-invasion scenarios. Documents entered into the Italian Senate record in 1990 referenced a strategy of tension doctrine, under which network assets were authorized to conduct false flag attacks on civilian targets during peacetime to influence domestic political outcomes. The Italian Parliamentary Commission investigating Gladio identified 14,000 operatives and 139 weapons caches buried across the country, containing explosives, surface-to-air missiles, and communications equipment. Cross-referencing of Gladio operational timelines with Italian domestic terrorism events from the 1970s and 1980s produced findings that the Commission's final report described as requiring further investigation, language that preceded the report's partial suppression. Judge Felice Casson, whose original 1990 investigation uncovered Gladio's existence, stated publicly that evidence connected Gladio assets to the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, which killed 85 people. No operative was ever convicted in connection with Gladio activities. NATO acknowledged Gladio's existence in a one-sentence press statement in November 1990 and has made no further public comment on the program in the 35 years since. Requests by the European Parliament for full disclosure of stay-behind network operations across all member states were met with refusals from every NATO government simultaneously, a coordinated response that the European Parliament resolution of November 22, 1990, noted with formal concern. Similar networks were subsequently confirmed in Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, France, Greece, Portugal, and Turkey. The operational mandates of those networks, and whether any were used against their own civilian populations, have not been disclosed. Archive requests in 6 of those countries remain pending. 85 people died in a train station. The network with documented connections to the attack was acknowledged. Its files were sealed, and every government involved refused to answer questions at the same moment. In 35 years, not one document has been released explaining why. Dead hand. In 1993, a former Soviet colonel named Valery Yarenich gave an interview to a small American arms control publication that received almost no mainstream coverage. Yarenich had spent his career inside the Soviet strategic rocket forces. What he described, in careful, measured language, was a system called Perimeter, known internally by its operators as Dead Hand. The system, developed between 1974 and 1985 and declared operational in 1985, was an automated nuclear launch command infrastructure designed to detect a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union and independently initiate a full retaliatory strike without requiring human authorization. If senior Soviet leadership were killed in a first strike before they could issue launch orders, Dead Hand would issue those orders itself. The system operated through a network of seismic, radiation, and atmospheric sensors. If those sensors detected a nuclear detonation on Soviet soil while the system was active, and if the system could not reach authorized human commanders within a preset window, it would automatically transmit launch commands directly to land-based ICBMs through a series of specially hardened command rockets. The entire sequence, from detection to launch authorization, was estimated at between 3 and 6 minutes. No American president, no NATO commander, and no missile defense system was aware of its existence until Yarenich's interview. The CIA's official assessment, according to documents released through the National Security Archive in 2009, was that Dead Hand was assessed as real, operational, and deeply concerning. The Russian government acknowledged the system's existence in a 1993 Izvestia article, but provided no technical details. Subsequent official Russian statements on whether perimeter remains operational have been inconsistent. In 2011, Russian Missile Forces commander Sergei Karakayev stated in an interview with Komsomolskaya Pravda that the system remains on combat duty. In 2018, a Russian government spokesperson denied that claim when asked by a Reuters correspondent. No clarification between those contradictory statements has been issued. The Dead Hand system's sensor network infrastructure was assessed by Western analysts as requiring ongoing maintenance. Satellite surveillance of known sensor installation sites in Siberia and Kazakhstan, documented in a 2015 Federation of American Scientists report, shows continued physical maintenance activity at multiple locations. What that maintenance is sustaining has not been officially explained by any government. A machine with the authority to end civilization was built, acknowledged once, and then placed behind contradictory statements and satellite imagery that no one in an official capacity will discuss. Whether it is waiting right now is a question that no government will answer on the record. Project Horizon. In June 1959, the United States Army submitted a classified feasibility study to the Department of Defense with a proposal that, had it been executed, would have permanently altered the nature of human civilization. The study, titled Project Horizon, called for the establishment of a permanent military base on the Moon by 1966, capable of housing 12 soldiers and functioning as a nuclear weapons platform. The base would be equipped with surface-to-surface missiles, capable of striking targets on Earth from lunar orbit, effectively placing American nuclear deterrence beyond the reach of any Soviet counterstrike. The document was 163 pages, technically detailed, and signed by officers at Army Ordnance Missile Command. It was submitted not as speculation, but as an actionable engineering proposal, with a projected budget of $6 billion over 6 years. Project Horizon was officially shelved when the space program was transferred from military to civilian control under NASA's authority. The 163-page document was declassified in 2014 and is available through the U.S. Army Center of Military History. What is not available is the classified annex. The original submission index, also available through the Center of Military History, lists a 4th volume designated Annex D, covering weapons systems integration and rules of engagement for the lunar installation, as a separate document submitted under a different classification authority. That annex does not appear in the declassified release. FOIA requests for Annex D submitted between 2014 and 2022 have been returned with the same response. The document cannot be confirmed or denied under applicable national security statutes. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 prohibits the placement of nuclear weapons in space or on celestial bodies. It was signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and 105 other nations. What the treaty does not prohibit is conventional military infrastructure. In 2020, President Trump signed Space Policy Directive 6, establishing a framework for the United States Space Force's Lunar Operations Doctrine. The directive's classified annexes were not published. In 2022, the Artemis Accords, a framework governing lunar activity signed by 23 nations, included provisions for the establishment of safety zones around lunar operations that independent legal scholars at the University of Nebraska Space Law Institute noted could be interpreted as de facto territorial exclusion zones. The Army proposed a nuclear missile base on the Moon in 1959. The weapons annex was classified separately and has never surfaced. The legal architecture for controlling territory on the Moon is now being quietly assembled by the same governments that drafted those original plans. The question that Project Horizon leaves open, the one that Annex D was written to answer, is not whether the Moon could be militarized. It is whether the decision about who controls it has already been made, in a document that the public is not allowed to confirm exists, by people whose names are not recorded in any history that has been cleared for release.